The Auto Show is back with your host, Alan Fromowitz, Sunday mornings at 9. Health and Wealth Radio, WNN.
The opinions expressed on the following sponsored program are strictly those of the host, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, management, or sponsors.
Amp2.tv presents Tell Us Your Business, where you're invited on the air to tell us what makes your business stand out in the community. It's important we hear from you to tell us all we need to know about what you do best. Tell Us Your Business uses the latest radio and television production systems, and all shows can be seen on amp2.tv. If you have a question for our guest, call 888-565-1470. Now, let's get ready as our guest hits the airwaves and informs us about what we need to know on Tell Us Your Business.
Good evening. My name is Ricky Siegel, and I welcome you to our debut of Sex Talk with Dr. Richard Siegel. I'm the director of Modern Sex Therapy Institute and a board-certified sex therapist. I hope some of you followed us over from last week. I was a guest with Sexually Speaking with Luba. Sadly, Luba was unable to continue at this hour, but I'm very pleased that Luba and our wonderful producer, Freddie, have asked me to take up the mantle and continue hosting the show. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be at this new hour, 9 p.m. Monday evenings. I'll be here every week. And for our debut this evening, again, if you followed us over from last Friday's Drive Time show, I had my go-to number one guest, my brilliant brother, Larry Siegel. And I've asked him to join me again tonight. Really enjoyed our conversation last week. We were talking about sexual health and sexuality education and the problems therein. And the conversations continued during the week. Got me thinking more about my work as a sex therapist, our work in the field of sexology, sex therapy, sexuality education. And, you know, it's a strange field we're in.
Indeed.
It's one of these things that there really shouldn't be, in a perfect world, in a sexually healthy world, there shouldn't be such a thing as a sexuality educator, because as we were discussing last week, we have another term for sexuality educator. It's parents. Right? So the fact that not only are there people who have that job description, but that it's so political and people fight and argue over who's allowed to say what, and can you say penis and vagina in a kid's classroom without sending them crazy to go busting out the doors and windows to run around and go have sex with everybody, right? But now, I'm coming back around more thinking about the job title, the role of a sex therapist, and it strikes me as just as bizarre.
Well, in a lot of ways, I think it is, because it seems to be taking something that's part of a whole person, taking it out of that whole person, looking at it sort of from the outside, looking at it almost in a vacuum, and then trying to put it back into a whole person.
Right.
As opposed to just working with the person in the context of their life, looking at their relationships as a whole, looking at how they approach the world. I think, I often describe certain fields that suffer from this dreaded disease that I've always described called terminal uniqueness.
Right.
It seems there's a lot of self-justification. I mean, sex ed, as you mentioned before, I've often wondered, why do we do this work? Why do we have this job? I appreciate it.
Right.
I'm certainly, it helps me to survive, and I love the work, but why should we have to do this?
Again, in a perfect world, there would be no need
right.
for sexuality educators, because parents would be doing that by virtue of having a child. We don't have to review how that happens. And, right, if two people through a sexual, hopefully loving act end up having a child, or choose to have a child in whatever means necessary, then they adopt that job title. They're responsible for raising a sexually healthy young person, right?
Right.
But now, just for a little context, there's a Facebook group. I don't need to tell you about it. You and I are very active members. I don't want to say anything about it because it's like, a favorite band. You tell too many of your friends and then you can't get tickets for the show. But, if any of you are listening, You know who you are. I have the utmost respect for you. And there was this conversation going this week about this idea, and referenced an article from two brilliant sex therapists in the field, Marta Miena and Itzhak Binnick. From several years ago. I was surprised I missed it and a little embarrassed. But they asked the question, is sex therapy, are we talking about a specialization or marginalization? I think that fits right into the point you just made. Let me just get this in. For those of you listening or watching, streaming live, we'd love to take your questions and comments. You can call us at 888-565-1470. Of course, we're broadcasting on 1470 AM, 95.3 on the FM dial. And once again, 888-565-1470. Call us, join the conversation. So one of the many wonderful points, actually, there was some pretty harsh criticisms about the field that we all need to take a look at within our field. But to talk about the happier things for me, what I found very validating and reassuring. But this is a really interesting point. Everyone has accepted since Masters and Johnson's work, of course, groundbreaking work on sexual response, and they've kind of invented sex therapy. Since the 70s, their book was 1970, right? Human Sexual Inadequacy, was that the name of it? That sex therapy has become the specialty.
Right.
So is that a specialization, or does that perpetuate the idea that, ooh, sex, we got to send you to a specialist. This is something only these people are trained. Because, I mean, look what it's done to the whole field of psychotherapy.
Well, I think, and in some ways, we have to really be honest and say that it has improved the field of psychotherapy. Because, you know, and I want to go back to just the term you used before, because I think that's really the linchpin for all of this. In a perfect world, we should not have to be doing this work, but we live in a country where we do have to do this work. We know, and this has been a bone of contention of ours for many, many years, very few, I mean, really very few, I think less than 2% of all medical schools in this country teach anything around sex and sexuality. If you look in clinical psychology program, none of them require or even include courses on sexuality. Right. The majority of marriage and family therapy programs at most will have one course on sexuality.
Right.
And it's the sort of proverbial redheaded stepchild. And I think it speaks to this larger context where we live in the most sexually repressed, sexually uncomfortable, sex-negative society in the developed world.
We're supposed to be number one.
Well, we are. We lead the world in just about everything that can go wrong with sex and sexuality.
Consequences of poor sexual health.
Right.
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 So, you know, the first time I guested with Luba a few weeks back, I made a comment and it got a little traction. You know, we've been saying this for years, that psychotherapists or couples counselors in particular, marriage and family therapists, I hate to pick on them, but it's right there in their name, right? Marriage and family therapists who don't talk about sex are like plumbers that don't do toilets.
Right.
And, you know, I thought I really want to own that. I think that needs to be...
Well, we can. I said that many years ago.
Can we trademark that? This needs to be a revolution because it's just insane. You know, Larry and I, for years in the course of our teaching, we just like to use absurdity to make a point. And I think this plumber analogy is a great one. No one in their right mind would tolerate a plumber coming into their house and saying, oh, no, I don't do toilets. The plumbing school I went to wasn't comfortable enough. I'll make you a great sink, but no, you'll have to call a specialist plumber. If you can't do toilets, don't be a plumber. Right. Get out of the field. Right. So now we have this situation with psychotherapists, and all of us sex therapists hear this every day. People go to a psychotherapist, individuals, couples, for whatever issues they need to deal with. And the moment something sexual comes up, there's this, ooh, I'm going to refer you. I deal with it with therapists who work in drug and alcohol treatment. And there, you know, the sex... Well,
they've been afraid of sex for a long time.
The proverbial 10-foot pole. It's a handful of treatment centers that we've been fortunate enough to get to understand that treating chemical dependency and addiction without looking at intimacy dysfunction. There's a nod to one of our heroes, Eli Coleman, from the University of Minnesota. intimacy dysfunction unaddressed will likely lead to failure of treatment. And we know there is not a medical or mental health treatment that has a more abysmal success rate than drug and alcohol treatment.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
to think, oh, don't talk. It's kind of like the treatment center, which is supposed to be medically based, just kind of cops the same philosophy from Alcoholics Anonymous and says, you know, don't have sex for a year or you'll relapse and ruin your recovery. Don't worry about it. Don't talk about it. If you can't get sexually healthy, how could you have a strong recovery? If you can't have a healthy recovery with a relationship with yourself.
And I think that's really the key, and that's where we stand out from the rest of the world.
Right.
Pretty most of the rest of the world looks at sex and sexuality as part of our humanity, sort of part of the core of who we are. We don't. In this country, we tend to look at sexuality through a lens of morality.
Yeah.
And it's a lens that basically was created basically in the 1600s. You know, we still live this Puritan ethic and
We'll
these
get there. We'll
values
catch up
that
soon.
underlie. Right.
Yeah.
And going back to the plumber and the toilet analogy, we can also extend that with a lot of what passes for sexuality education in this abstinence-only nonsense that is so pervasive.
Sure.
You know, if we use that same analogy, that is akin to, we want to know, what can I do to make sure my toilet doesn't keep stopping up? And the only solution we get is don't use it.
You're right. Or plug it up for good.
Right, keep it clogged, just don't use it.
Yeah.
Right? So I think we've just never really gotten a place of comfort. We've never gotten to a place where we look at sex or sexuality in particular as something we are. We still look at it as something we do, and we have a lot of judgment that we put on the do. I tell people a lot that the sex is not a verb; it's a noun.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a big missing piece, because as long as we don't accept sex and sexuality as not only a normal and natural part of who and what we are, but an incredibly important aspect to our optimal functioning and overall well-being.
Right. Right. Excellent. So we have this weird kind of, well, specialty. And you know, again, I'm not knocking it. I'm currently making my living. You know, as I introduced myself, I'm the director of Modern Sex Therapy Institutes. I have a brilliant partner, Dr. Rachel Needle, a West Palm Beach psychotherapist. Larry, of course, is part of our principal faculty. We have some of the leading figures in the field, I'm very proud to say, as part of our faculty. And we train psychotherapists and medical professionals, physicians, nurse practitioners, physical therapists in sexual medicine, sexuality counseling, and sex therapists. And the point is, still, why is this such a specialty that only such a tiny percentage of therapists endeavor when it should be part of the training of all therapists? Right? We just we had our annual sex therapy conference, organization we are proudly affiliated with called ASECT. I know it's a mouthful. The American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. You can find them at asect.org. They are a certifying a private member organization that certifies its members as sex therapists, counselors. Also, as we know, this bizarre history, 25 plus years, I'm trying to figure out how Florida is the only state in the United States of America that has a law on the books that for a psychotherapist to hold themselves out as a certified sex therapist, they have to be able to prove this specialized training. In every other state, 49 out of 50 states in the country, you're a sex therapist when you say you are.
Right.
Anybody who's a therapist that went to a conference or a workshop or said, I like sex, I like talking about sex, regardless of any training, can call themselves a sex therapist. So we train these folks, but I was out in Las Vegas for our annual conference and looking around this giant room, and isn't it wonderful? We see old friends, but there was like, 600, 700 sex therapists and educators and counselors from all over the country and the world.
The world, right.
There has got to be 600 therapists between West Palm Beach and Miami.
Sure.
At least.
Sure.
Maybe double that, triple that. Why are there a tiny, like less than 1% of all the billions of therapists in this country have this mysterious, kind of scary specialization that they need to send their patients away to.
Right. And I think that relates to the article that you were mentioning. That's part of the marginalization, because that, I think, also goes along with the fact that this is the only area in education and in therapy where a lot of people seem to believe that the only real credential or training they need is their own experience. We talk about the sexuality educators for years, especially in working with adolescents who have absolutely no training or background in adolescent development or understanding, except that they were once an adolescent. They have no training whatsoever in sexuality other than maybe they have had sex, and they are coming in with intention. Right. And you're right. They're interested and they care.
They want to help.
Right.
But let's
put that in real life. Would you bring your car to a mechanic who knew nothing about engines, who knew nothing about how a car worked, but they really cared about cars running well?
Right.
In any other context, it doesn't work. But in sex, it seems to be the norm. And I think that is part of that marginalization. There is a taking for granted, right? A lot of therapists say, well, sex, it just takes care of themselves. If we work on the communication, the sex will fix itself.
You know, I have to say, again, all due respect to many marriage and family therapists that I love and admire and respect, many of the older ones admit that was kind of a cop-out credo, this idea that if you work on the communication, the sex will take care of itself, and everybody knows it doesn't.
Right. But the irony of that is if you work on the sex, the communication gets fixed.
There you go.
Yeah.
But every sex therapist gets patients all the time, couples that come in that say, we were seeing this therapist, we went in week after week after week. I recently had a couple that said they went to a marriage and family therapist 4 weeks in a row, literally asking from the first session, can we please talk about this sexual problem? And the therapist was saying, no, not yet. We have to continue talking about your communication. And, to paraphrase, whose poop is it anyway?
Right.
If that's going on, that's the therapist's issue.
Sure. It's the same thing with, I think, the lead foot that, seems on the surface to have merit, which really doesn't. That so many therapists also believe that, well, you can't just jump into sex. You have to build trust. You have to build rapport. Not realizing that the reality is if they're coming to you for a sexual problem, that's what you need to talk about.
And there's where you'll make your rapport and connect with your couple or your individual.
But I think a lot of these things really speak to the fact that most therapists, and we've spoken to them, we know that this is what so many of them do experience and think. They're just not comfortable talking about it.
But that's my point. They really need to self-examine whether or not they should be in this field.
Right.
If a therapist, and again, we get this constantly, someone will refer to a sex therapist because of an issue of sexual orientation. Oh, you're gay or lesbian? I'm afraid that's outside my wheelhouse. I'll have to refer you. You're trans or you're kinky.
Right.
If you're a licensed clinician, you better be comfortable. If you're not comfortable, you got some homework to do.
Right.
Again, if you're a plumber, you better be prepared to work on toilets or get out of the field, right? So to call yourself a certified sex therapist, I would admit that's kind of audacious.
Yeah.
Right? Remember, like in ethics classes, we talk about the word professional comes from the verb to profess.
Right.
Basically like standing on a mountaintop and yelling to the world, I have this skill, you could pay me money for it.
Right. But it's with the force of a promise.
Right.
Right. That's the proclamation.
So, and that means you better be able to back it up and be able to have the comfort, the confidence, and the competence to deal with what walks in the door. So part of the discussion on this listserv thread, again, are they specializations or marginalizations? If somebody says, well, I don't really have that much experience working with polyamorous couples, so I'm going to refer you, the point should be get that experience.
Right.
Get yourself trained. Don't call yourself a certified sex therapist if there isn't any sexual problem that you at least have the basic competence to be able to address.
Right. And I think, again, even within the field of sexology, a lot of sex therapists and educators, the reality is a lot of you are not comfortable talking about sex and sexuality either. There's so much of that, and I think that's where we see a lot of that. Oh, no, you got to refer that to somebody else. We see that with a lot of gender issues. You have let's say, a heterosexual therapist that has a gay client or couple that comes in. Now, this is couples therapy.
Exactly.
Right? This is no different than anything else, but you'll often see the hackles go up, the sphincters tighten up, and you say, no, we have to refer you to somebody who is an expert on that.
How many times have we heard, how do you do sex therapy with a gay couple?
Right.
And of course, the only answer is the same way you do sex therapy with any couple.
Right.
Right? A couple's a couple.
Right.
If a couple comes in, my first thought shouldn't be, do I know enough about these people and how they have sex, or those people? My interest should be these people sitting in front of me and how they have sex, or what their problem is.
Right.
Now, now to defend my livelihood, right? Because of this lack of sexual comfort and constant avoidance, we need to train these sex therapists. We need to get patients who are seeing therapists and paying them their hard-earned money to say, what do you mean you're not trained in this? Right? We know there's this book, all therapists know, the kind of the therapy Bible, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, which lists all of the mental illnesses that can be applied to a person. And of course, there's a whole section, a whole chapter on sexual dysfunctions and disorders. And so it seems that all of these clinicians, we're supposed to know that book front and back, and that's our working book. But it seems the majority of therapists, I mean, like more than 99%, just seem to skip that whole chapter.
Well, sure. Well, how much of that also relates to the fact that insurance companies also skip that whole chapter?
That's true, too.
Right? Here's a mental health diagnosis. Right? Here's a mental health diagnosis. Here's a mental health diagnosis. Here's one we're not really comfortable with, so let's just skip that. We're not going to cover it. We don't have to think about it, and we'll go back to all these other ones.
Right.
So I think this is, again, a pervasive problem across the board. Right?
Sure.
Doctors, therapists, and, of course, individuals, because that's our legacy. We continue to perpetuate this discomfort with sex and sexuality. How many times have we heard people say, hey, nobody talked to me about that, and I turned out just fine?
Yeah.
And we all know that we have to sometimes bite our tongue, because we really want to see sometimes, no, you really didn't turn out so fine.
Yeah.
But it's just one of those things that we take for granted because I think we're just uncomfortable from the get-go. Right?
Remember when we first started doing more outreach to medical professionals in particular, and most obviously urologists and gynecologists, the go-to PP doctors, and boy parts for urologists and girl parts for gynecologists, even though, of course, women have urological systems just like men. But the assumption, people think if they have a problem down there, those are the doctors they would see. And of course, most people don't know what you said earlier, that even PP doctors have no training in sexuality. So we used to kid around in some of our earlier medical students that, these genitals you're working on all day, they're attached to people.
That's right.
And people actually use them in ways that affect their relationships, their lives, their quality of life. The good news, I think, with the rise of sexual medicine, and unfortunately it took a drug like Viagra to kind of give birth to this subspecialty in medicine, is the recognition more and more on the part of medicine, the whole medical field, to recognize that sexuality is a quality of life issue.
Exactly. Unfortunately, still very much from a plumbing issue.
Right.
We're also often reminding physicians, particularly urologists and gynecologists, that, as much as you may be an expert on the parts, that's not really what it is. Another analogy we often use is you can be the greatest mechanic in the world. It doesn't make you a good driver.
Right.
And again, that idea of being able to work with the people who are attached to these genitals is very, very important. And most don't. Right? Now, again, a lot of it is time. For a lot of medical professionals, sex represents that proverbial door handle confession.
Right.
If they only have 5 minutes to be with a patient, A lot of them are wanting to get out of the room before that even comes up, because that's a discussion that they're not prepared to have, they're not able to have, and they don't have time.
The exam room, and the patient says, "Oh, doc, by the way, there's this thing. It's really embarrassing," and you can see their eyes rolling from behind their head. They want to get out of that room.
Right.
Now, if there was a sex therapist down the hall, in every urologist office, in every gynecologist office, how about every cardiologist office, gastroenterologist? You know what my favorite of all is? Obstetrics, not just gynecology, but OB.
Right.
Check this out. The very thing that makes people obstetric patients, sex.
Yeah.
Doesn't get talked about through the whole process: pregnancy, labor, delivery, after the delivery, going home with the baby. Nobody's talking about sex. That book, that famous book, Everything What to Expect When You're Expecting, sure covers baby proof in the house, doesn't it?
There's nothing in there.
Nothing, except sometimes dad is with no preparation at all, shoved into the delivery room, traumatized. Then they're sent home with this beautiful swaddled baby that sometimes the only advice they get is no sex for 6 weeks. And nobody says, what does that mean?
Right.
No intercourse, no pleasuring. Is there maybe stitches from an episiotomy, or maybe pain, or maybe if the new mom feels like it or doesn't feel like? Where does this no sex for 6 weeks come from? Instead, all it does is start this separation.
Right.
Right? They're bonding with the baby. Dad's often feeling left out. And I don't want to sound heterosexist with this, because it happens with all kinds of couples and all kinds of families. But if new parents were coached and how to keep their relationship sexy and erotic, even as they become parents. I had a wonderful couple come in to see me because they were pregnant, and they said the best thing I ever heard a new couple say to a sex therapist: "We don't want to turn into our parents. So we want to get into this sex therapy while we're pregnant, so the baby doesn't change this wonderful sex life we have."
And that's a wonderful thing when we see that, So I think really it all comes down to this element of the sexual discomfort that really sort of drives almost everything that this society is about. So I think on an individual basis, on a professional basis, we want to be comfortable with our own bodies and accept them as natural, accept sex and sexuality as a natural part of who we are.
We got a wrap. I thank you all for joining us. Thank you, my brother Larry Siegel. Again, my name is Ricky Siegel, Director of Modern Sex Therapy Institutes. Be back next Monday night. Please join us 9 p.m. Monday, and hopefully every Monday after that. Join us on Facebook. Call in. We'll look forward to it. Thanks very much for joining us.
This has been Tell Us Your Business, where a special guest comes on every week and tells us what they do. All shows can be seen on amp2.tv, and if you wish to be a guest, call 866-224-5422 and tell us about your business. That's 866-224-5422. This has been an amp2.tv production.